I watched my father pour himself a glass of expensive bourbon, not even 20 minutes after we lowered my grandmother into the ground. He slammed a stiff piece of paper onto her antique mahogany dining table and looked me dead in the eye. "You need to pack your bags and get out of this house," he said with a cruel smile. "Grandma left no will. Everything goes to me, and your brother is my sole heir. You get absolutely nothing." What my father did not know was that the very estate he was kicking me out of already belonged to me. Furthermore, the stranger who was about to knock on our front door carried a single document that would eventually send my father to federal prison. "My name is Harper. I am 32 years old and work as a forensic accountant. If you have ever watched toxic family members show their true colors, the second money is involved. Tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to hear how I systematically dismantled their empire of lies." Growing up in Atlanta meant maintaining appearances. To outsiders, our family seemed like a pillar of the community. But inside our walls, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. My grandmother Odessa was the only source of warmth I ever knew. She owned a massive commercial real estate portfolio right in the center of the city, while my father Elijah and my older brother Trey spent their lives begging her for handouts. I spent my time learning how to build my own wealth. I escaped their toxicity early and built a successful firm. I only maintained contact for the sake of my grandmother. Now she was gone. The funeral repast was held at her historic estate. Relatives filled the living room, eating catered fried chicken and potato salad. The scent of white lilies mixed with the heavy tension in the room. I stood quietly in the corner, holding a glass of sweet tea. I was mourning the only person who had ever truly loved me. My father Elijah did not share my grief. He was practically vibrating with excitement. He stepped to the head of the long dining table and clinked his spoon against his crystal glass to command attention. The chatter in the room died down. Elijah cleared his throat and puffed out his chest. He looked at the gathered relatives with fake sorrow. "As her only surviving child, it falls upon me to shoulder the heavy burden of my mother's legacy," he announced loudly. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded document. "I have just spoken with the state registry. My mother passed away without leaving a legal will. Therefore, the entire estate, including this property and all commercial holdings, transfers directly to me." Murmurs erupted around the room. I took a slow sip of my tea. I knew for a fact that Grandma Odessa had a will. She was a meticulous businesswoman who never left anything to chance. But I stayed silent. I wanted to see how far he would go. Elijah raised his hand to silence the crowd. "I am also making an official declaration today," he continued. "This family needs a strong male leader. I am officially naming my son Trey as the sole heir to the Odessa estate. He will take over the property management business immediately." Trey puffed out his chest and smirked. He was 35 years old and had never held a real job in his life. He spent his days gambling and living off credit cards. The idea of him managing a multi-million-dollar real estate empire was laughable. Then my father turned his gaze directly toward me. The fake sorrow vanished from his face, replaced by pure malice. The room grew uncomfortably quiet as he pointed his finger at me. "As for you, Harper," he sneered, "you have always been a massive disappointment. You chose to distance yourself from this family, to play on your little computer and look at spreadsheets. You are lucky we even included you in the funeral. Pity goes a long way." I set my glass down on a side table. I looked at him calmly. "Are you really doing this right now, Elijah?" I asked. "She has not even been in the ground for a full hour. Do not question me in my own house," he snapped back. His face turned red. "In fact, I want you out. Go upstairs, pack your cheap clothes, and get off my property. You have exactly 1 hour before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." A few aunts and uncles gasped, but nobody stepped forward to defend me. They were too afraid of losing their own potential payouts from Elijah. Trey walked over and stood next to his father, crossing his arms. "You heard the boss," Trey laughed. "Go back to your little apartment, Harper. This is big league business now. We do not need a glorified calculator getting in the way of our family legacy." I did not yell, I did not cry. I simply looked at the two men who shared my blood and felt a deep sense of pity for their stupidity. I knew exactly what they were trying to do. They assumed because I was a woman and the youngest child, I would just roll over and accept their bullying. They thought they could forge a few documents and steal millions of dollars right out from under me. I nodded slowly. All right, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. If that is how you want to play this, Elijah, I will leave. But you should know that you are making the biggest mistake of your entire life. He threw his head back and laughed loudly. What are you going to do, Harper? He mocked. Audit me. I turned around and grabbed my coat from the hallway closet. I was fully prepared to walk out the door and let my lawyers handle the rest. I had enough evidence securely stored on my servers to freeze every single asset he thought he owned. But before my hand could even touch the brass doorknob, a sharp knock echoed through the quiet foyer. The timing was so perfect it felt scripted. Elijah stopped laughing. The relatives craned their necks to see who was arriving so late to the gathering. I pulled the heavy oak door open. Standing on the porch was a tall man in a sharp charcoal suit, holding a thick leather briefcase. I recognized him instantly. It was Julian Pierce, a senior partner at one of the most ruthless financial law firms in the state of Georgia. He did not look at my father or my brother. He stepped over the threshold, ignoring the confused whispers of the crowd, and walked directly up to me. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. He pressed it firmly into my hands. His expression was dead serious, but I could see a hint of a smile in his eyes. He leaned in close and whispered so only I could hear. The paperwork is finalized and the traps are set. It is time to tell them who you really are. I looked at the envelope, feeling the massive weight of my grandmother's true final wish resting right in my palms. Before I could even break the red wax seal on the envelope, a loud thud echoed from the top of the sweeping wooden staircase. Everyone in the foyer looked up. There stood Brittany, my brother's wife, dragging a heavy black, heavy-duty trash bag across the vintage runner rug. Brittany was a woman who had married into our family purely for the perceived wealth. She was wearing a black designer cocktail dress that I knew for a fact was paid for using one of my grandmother's secondary credit cards. She looked down at me with an expression of pure disgust, as if I was a stray dog that had wandered into her pristine home. Without a single word of warning, she lifted her expensive heel and kicked the trash bag down the stairs. It tumbled violently over the polished wooden steps. It hit the marble floor of the foyer with a sickening smack right next to my boots. The thin plastic tore open, spilling my modest professional clothes, my sweaters, and my favorite running shoes across the pristine floor. I told you to get her things out of here 10 minutes ago, Trey, she complained loudly as she slowly descended the stairs. She ran her hand along the original oak banister, as if she already owned it. We have the appraisers coming tomorrow morning, and I do not want this place smelling like cheap perfume and desperation. I looked at my belongings scattered on the floor and then looked up at Brittany. She reached the bottom of the stairs and linked her arm through Trey's, acting like the lady of the manor. She did not even acknowledge Julian standing beside me. She probably assumed he was just some low-level clerk my father had hired to process the eviction paperwork. You really think you can just stand there and stare at me, Harper? She sneered. Her voice dripped with that particular kind of condescension she always reserved for me. You have always been so utterly pathetic. Sneaking around this dusty old house trying to play the devoted granddaughter while the rest of us were actually making moves. Well, your little act did not pay off. Elijah is in charge now, and Trey is the heir. That means I am the lady of this house, and I want you gone. I kept my hands firmly wrapped around the sealed envelope. I did not raise my voice. I did not bend down to pick up my clothes. I simply asked her what exactly she planned to do with my grandmother's legacy. Brittany laughed, a sharp, grating sound that echoed in the quiet room. Legacy, she mocked, rolling her eyes. This place is a crumbling eyesore in the middle of a prime real estate zone. You really think we are going to keep this moldy old museum running? Please. We have already been in talks with a major commercial developer. They have been trying to get their hands on this land for 3 years, but your stubborn grandmother refused to sell. We are tearing this whole place down, Harper. Every last brick. Trey puffed out his chest, standing taller next to his wife. That is right, he added proudly. We are liquidating the entire portfolio. The developers are offering $15 million for this lot alone. We are going to take that money and invest it in real high-end projects, not this historical preservation garbage. To hear them speak so casually about destroying the only safe haven I had ever known made my blood run cold. This house was not just a building. It was a testament to the resilience of a Black woman who had fought tooth and nail against systemic redlining to build an empire from the ground up. My grandmother had outsmarted banks, politicians, and predatory lenders. And now her own son and his entitled wife were going to hand it all over to a gentrifying developer for a fraction of its true value, just so they could buy luxury cars and designer clothes. I looked at the two of them and felt a cold wave of absolute clarity wash over me. They were not just greedy, they were dangerously ignorant. $15 million was an insultingly low offer for a commercial lot of this size in downtown Atlanta. The developers were trying to fleece them, and my brother was too foolish to even realize it. You do not know the first thing about real estate, Brittany, I said calmly. Neither of you do. If you sell this land to those developers, you are throwing away generational wealth for a quick paycheck. Brittany took a step forward, pointing her manicured finger at my chest. Do not lecture me about wealth, you glorified calculator, she spat. What do you know about making real money? You sit in a cubicle all day looking at spreadsheets and running data analysis for other people's companies. You are a number cruncher, Harper. A nobody. You do not have the vision to understand what Trey and I are building. We are about to be $15 million richer, and you are about to be homeless. I glanced sideways at Julian. The high-powered attorney was standing perfectly still, holding his expensive briefcase. He was watching Brittany with a look of mild amusement. He knew exactly what was inside the envelope I was holding. He knew that the $15 million deal Brittany was bragging about was completely worthless, because neither she nor Trey had the legal right to sell a single blade of grass on this property. But Julian was a professional. He stayed completely silent, letting my sister-in-law dig her own grave. My father, Elijah, stepped up behind Brittany, nodding in agreement. You heard her, Harper, he said coldly. The decision is final. We are cashing out, and you are not seeing a single penny of it. Now pick up your trash and get out of my house before I have you physically thrown out. The relatives in the room watched in stunned silence. A few of them looked away, too cowardly to make eye contact with me. They were already calculating how much of that $15 million they could beg off my father. Nobody cared about the fact that they were standing in the very home my grandmother had poured her blood, sweat, and tears into preserving. They only cared about the payout. I looked down at the torn trash bag. I saw a framed photograph of me and Grandma Odessa peeking out from under a pile of sweaters. The glass was cracked from the fall. That tiny crack in the glass did something to me. It extinguished whatever small flicker of family loyalty I had left. It erased any guilt I might have felt about what I was going to do next. I am not picking that up, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. And I am not leaving until I say exactly what needs to be said. Brittany rolled her eyes and pulled out her phone. Fine, she huffed, tapping aggressively on the screen. Have it your way. I am calling the police right now. I cannot wait to see them drag you out of here in handcuffs. It will be the perfect end to a very long, exhausting day. Call them, I challenged, stepping away from the door and walking directly toward her. Call the police. Brittany, tell them there is an unwanted guest in the house. But you better make sure you know who actually owns the floor you are standing on before they get here. Brittany paused, her thumb hovering over the screen. She frowned, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and anger. What is that supposed to mean? She demanded. I did not answer her. Instead, I finally looked down at the heavy red wax seal on the envelope Julian had given me. The moment of truth had arrived. I broke the thick red wax seal on the envelope. The sound of the cracking wax was the only noise in the quiet foyer. Everyone was staring at me. I slid my fingers inside and pulled out a stack of heavy parchment papers. The top document had the official gold seal of the state of Georgia pressed into the corner. I scanned the first few lines and felt my stomach drop before soaring with a fierce, undeniable triumph. It was a certificate of adoption dated 14 years ago. My father, Elijah, stepped forward, his face twisting into a nasty scowl. "What is that?" he demanded, reaching out to snatch the papers right out of my hands. Julian stepped smoothly between us, blocking my father's reach with his broad shoulder. "I would not do that." "Elijah," Julian said, his voice dangerously calm and professional. "Those documents belong to my client, and you have absolutely no legal right to touch them or her." Elijah scoffed, looking from Julian to me with pure hatred. "Your client," he repeated, mocking the words. "What kind of joke are you trying to play, Harper? Who is this man in my house?" I looked up from the papers and locked eyes with the man who had tormented me my entire life. "He is my attorney," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "And according to this state-certified document, you are no longer my father." The room erupted into loud gasps. My aunts and uncles started whispering frantically. Brittany dropped her expensive clutch onto the floor, and Trey stumbled back a step, looking confused. "What the hell are you talking about?" Trey yelled, clenching his fists. I held up the certificate of adoption so they could all clearly see the state seal. 14 years ago, I explained, my voice echoing off the grand staircase. "When you tried to use my social security number to open fraudulent credit accounts and borrow money from loan sharks, Grandma Odessa found out. She did not just pay off your massive debts, Elijah. She filed a quiet petition with the state courts to permanently strip you of your parental rights. And because of your extensive criminal record for fraud, she won easily. She legally adopted me to protect my financial future from your abuse. I am not your daughter anymore. Legally speaking, in the eyes of the law, I am your sister." Elijah's face drained of all color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked like he had just been punched in the stomach. Julian reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out another thick-bound legal document. "That is not all," Julian added, holding up the heavy file. "Odessa also established a blind trust to protect her legacy. Because she knew you would try to steal her assets the very second she passed away, she transferred every single commercial property, every bank account, and this entire historic estate into that trust. She named Harper as the sole beneficiary and the sole executor. That fake death certificate you are waving around, Elijah, is completely useless. The estate does not go to the next of kin because the estate is already legally owned by the trust, and the trust is completely controlled by Harper." Trey let out a loud, panicked laugh, trying to brush it off. "That is a lie," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Julian. "You are just some scam artist she hired to scare us off. We already have a corporate buyer. We are selling this land for $15 million tomorrow morning." Julian smiled, a cold, clinical smile that made Trey flinch. "You cannot sell what you do not own, Trey. If you try to sign a commercial real estate contract with that developer using forged documents, you will be committing federal wire fraud. I highly suggest you reconsider your next moves before you end up in a federal penitentiary." Brittany pushed her way past Trey, her face red with fury and embarrassment. "This is garbage!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "You cannot just walk in here with some fake papers and steal our money. I am calling the police right now. I already dialed them before this man even walked in. They are probably pulling up to the driveway right now." As if on cue, the flashing blue and red lights of a police cruiser reflected brightly through the stained glass windows of the front door. A heavy, authoritative knock sounded a few seconds later. "Anke." Brittany practically ran to the door and threw it open. Two armed police officers stood on the porch, looking confused by the sheer number of people gathered in the foyer. "Officers, thank God you are here," Brittany gasped, pointing a dramatic manicured finger at me. "This woman is trespassing on our private property. She was kicked out of this house, and now she and this strange man are threatening us with forged legal documents. I want her removed and arrested immediately." The older officer stepped inside, resting his hand on his duty belt. He looked at me and then at Julian, analyzing the situation. "Is this true, Mom?" he asked, looking directly at me. Before I could speak, Julian stepped forward and handed the officer his state bar credentials, along with a certified copy of the trust documents. "Officer, My name is Julian Pierce, and I am a senior partner at Pierce and Associates. My client Harper is the legal owner of this property through a verified trust. The people currently attempting to evict her have absolutely no legal standing to be here. The officer looked over the documents carefully, his eyebrows raising as he read the official state seals and watermarks. He handed them back to Julian respectfully and turned to my father. "Sir, do you have any proof of ownership?" the officer asked Elijah. Elijah stammered, his face turning a deep shade of purple. "I am her son," he sputtered desperately. "She died without a will. It is my house by right." The officer shook his head. "I am sorry, sir, but these trust documents completely supersede any next of kin claims. Technically speaking, you and your family are the ones trespassing on this property." Brittany let out a shrill scream of absolute frustration. "This is insane!" she yelled, stomping her foot like a toddler. "They are lying. Check the county registry. Do your job and arrest her." I stepped forward and gently placed my hand on Julian's arm. "It is okay, Julian," I said quietly, making sure the police could hear my calm demeanor. "Let them stay for now." The officer looked at me completely surprised. "You want them to stay, Mom?" he asked, sounding confused. I looked at Elijah, Trey, and Brittany. They were panicking like trapped animals in a cage. Their $15 million payday was slipping through their greedy fingers, and they had no idea how to stop it. I knew that kicking them out tonight would only cause a messy physical scene. I wanted to destroy them methodically and legally. I wanted them to dig their hole even deeper. "Yes, officer," I said smoothly. "My grandmother just passed away a few hours ago, and emotions are running very high. I do not want anyone arrested tonight. I will leave voluntarily and let them have the house for the weekend to grieve." I reached into my purse, pulled out my spare set of heavy brass house keys, and dropped them onto the marble floor right next to my scattered clothes. "Keep the keys, Trey," I said softly, looking him dead in the eye. "Enjoy the house while you can. Because come Monday morning, I am not just taking the house back. I am taking everything." I turned and walked out the front door into the cool evening air with Julian right behind me. I let them think they won the battle. But as a forensic accountant, I knew something they did not. I was about to follow the digital money trail and win the entire war. The cool night air hit my face as the heavy oak door slammed shut behind us. The muffled sounds of my family panicking inside the house faded away as I walked down the brick pathway toward the circular driveway. Julian walked silently beside me. We reached his sleek black town car parked under the glow of a vintage street lamp. He opened the passenger door for me, and I slid onto the soft leather seat. I placed the thick stack of parchment papers on my lap. Julian got into the driver's seat and started the engine, but he did not pull away immediately. The quiet hum of the car felt like a sanctuary after the toxic chaos we had just left behind. I looked down at the documents illuminated by the soft amber glow of the dashboard lights. The adrenaline that had been keeping me standing straight for the past hour finally began to recede, leaving behind a profound emotional weight. I picked up the certificate of adoption again and ran my fingers over the raised gold seal of the state of Georgia. It was not just a piece of legal leverage. It was proof that someone had truly loved me enough to fight for me. Julian looked over at me, his professional demeanor softening just a fraction. "She wanted to tell you for years, Harper," he said quietly, "but she knew that if Elijah ever found out before she passed away, he would have made your life a living hell. She needed you to be completely independent and untouchable before the truth came out." I nodded slowly, tears stinging the corners of my eyes. I remembered exactly what had happened 14 years ago. I was just 18 years old trying to apply for student loans for college when I received a barrage of rejection letters. When I pulled my credit report, I discovered a nightmare. My father Elijah had stolen my social security number. He had opened a dozen credit cards and taken out massive personal loans in my name to fund his failing business ventures and his hidden gambling habits. He had completely destroyed my financial future before my adult life had even begun. When Grandma Odessa found out, she was furious. But she was also a brilliant strategist. She did not just yell at him or bail him out like other enablers would have done. She hired Julian. Together, they filed a quiet but aggressive petition in the state courts. Armed with a mountain of evidence proving his financial abuse and fraud, she gave Elijah an ultimatum. He could either face federal prison for identity theft, or he could voluntarily surrender his parental rights. Elijah, being the coward he always was, chose to sign his rights away to save his own skin. Grandma Odessa formally adopted me. She erased my legal ties to the man who had tried to ruin me. "You do realize what this means going forward?" Julian asked, pulling me back to the present. He shifted the car into drive and slowly steered us out of the massive iron gates of the estate. I looked out the window, watching the silhouette of the historic house fade into the darkness. "I know exactly what it means," I replied, my voice steadying. "Legally speaking, Elijah is no longer my father. He is my brother. And Trey is no longer my brother. He is my nephew." Julian let out a short, dry laugh. "Exactly," he said. "And because Odessa placed the entire estate, including all her commercial properties and liquid assets, into a blind trust naming you as the sole beneficiary, they cannot touch a single dime. The trust bypasses the probate courts completely. That fake death certificate Elijah was waving around in the dining room is useless. He is trying to claim an inheritance that does not exist because the assets are already legally owned by your trust." I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes for a brief moment. The sheer brilliance of my grandmother's plan was breathtaking. She had built an impenetrable fortress around her wealth and handed me the only key. But as a forensic accountant, my mind immediately started looking for the missing variables. Elijah was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. If he and Brittany had already lined up a commercial developer and arranged a $15 million sale for tomorrow morning, they had to have documentation. A major corporate buyer would never agree to hand over that kind of money without seeing a title or a property deed. I opened my eyes and reached into my oversized leather tote bag. I pulled out my laptop and powered it on. The bright screen lit up the dark cabin of the car. "What are you doing?" Julian asked, glancing over at the screen as he merged onto the highway. "I am going to do my job," I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I connected to a secure mobile hotspot. "Elijah and Trey are planning to sign a contract tomorrow. To do that, they need to prove they own the land. Since we know they do not own the land, they must have manufactured a fake property deed. I need to find out exactly what they forged, who notarized it, and how deep they are into this scam." I logged into my encrypted server and bypassed the standard public registry portals. I accessed the deeper municipal databases using my forensic credentials. I started tracing the recent property inquiries on my grandmother's address. It did not take long for the digital money trail to start unraveling right in front of my eyes. "Julian," I said, my eyes scanning the lines of data scrolling across my screen. "Elijah filed a quitclaim deed 3 weeks ago while Grandma Odessa was in the hospital on a ventilator. He forged her signature, transferring the title of the estate directly to his name. And he used a disgraced notary public in downtown Atlanta to stamp it." Julian gripped the steering wheel tighter. "That is a federal crime, Harper. If he presents that deed to the developers tomorrow, he is committing wire fraud on a massive scale." I smiled a cold, calculating smile. "It gets worse, Julian, or better depending on how you look at it." I clicked on a secondary financial link attached to Trey's name. In order to pay the massive bribes required to get these fake documents rushed through the system, Trey and Brittany needed fast cash. And since neither of them has a legitimate income, guess where they got it? Where Julian asked, his tone turning sharp. I brought up a scanned copy of a recent lien. They took out a second mortgage on their own personal house. I explained, reading the numbers. They borrowed $2 million from a predatory shadow lender, a loan shark. They used their own home as collateral to finance the fraud against my grandmother, expecting to pay it off instantly with the $15 million sale tomorrow. The car was silent, except for the sound of the tires on the asphalt. The trap was no longer just about taking the house back. My father and my brother had literally bet their entire lives on a sale that I was never going to let happen. The moment that deal fell through tomorrow, they would not just be exposed as frauds, they would lose everything they owned. Julian pulled his sleek town car up to the valet stand of my luxury high-rise apartment building in Midtown Atlanta. He put the car in park and turned to face me. The glow from the streetlights illuminated the serious expression on his face. "I will have the final trust documents couriered to the developer boardroom by 11:30 tomorrow morning," he said, his voice steady and professional. "You just make sure your digital evidence is bulletproof, Harper. We only get one shot to lock them in a room with the federal agents." I patted my leather tote bag where my laptop rested. "Do not worry, Julian," I replied. "Numbers do not lie, and they certainly do not forge signatures." I thanked him for standing by my side at the house and stepped out into the humid night air. I spent the next 6 hours sitting at my kitchen island surrounded by glowing monitors. I did not sleep a single wink. As a forensic accountant, I was used to pulling all-nighters to track down missing millions for corporate clients. But this was personal. I meticulously compiled every single digital footprint my father and brother had left behind. I downloaded the forged quitclaim deed with the fake notary stamp. I pulled the wire transfer records from the predatory loan shark who had given Trey and Brittany the $2 million advance. I packaged everything into a secure encrypted file and sent it directly to a contact of mine at the white-collar crime division of the FBI. By the time the sun began to rise over the Atlanta skyline, the trap was perfectly set. My family thought they were walking into a boardroom to collect $15 million. In reality, they were walking directly into a federal indictment. I took a long, hot shower to wash away the toxic energy of my grandmother's house. I dressed for war. I put on a tailored emerald green power suit that cost more than my brother's first car. I slipped on my designer heels and grabbed my briefcase. Before heading to my office to coordinate the final details with the real estate developers, I decided to stop by an upscale artisan coffee shop in Buckhead to get a double espresso. The cafe was bright and airy, filled with the smell of roasted beans and expensive pastries. I was standing near the pickup counter waiting for my order when the little bell above the door chimed. I did not need to turn around to know who had just walked in. The loud, entitled voice echoing through the quiet shop was unmistakable. "Make it a venti iced caramel macchiato with extra drizzle and do not burn the espresso this time," the voice demanded. I slowly turned my head. It was Brittany. My sister-in-law was standing at the register wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors. She was holding 3 massive shopping bags from luxury boutiques on the avenue. But the most glaring detail was the giant, gaudy diamond ring sparkling on her finger. It was easily a 4-carat rock, and it looked entirely brand new. She paid for her sugary drink by tapping a shiny black credit card against the machine. I knew exactly which loan shark had issued that line of credit. Brittany turned away from the register and finally noticed me standing there. She froze for a fraction of a second. Then a cruel, triumphant smirk spread across her face. She practically strutted over to me, letting her expensive shopping bags bump against the tables. "Well, well, well," Brittany gloated, pulling down her sunglasses to look me up and down. "I am honestly surprised they let you in here, Harper. Did you sleep in your car last night? I told Trey we should have at least let you take a blanket from the trash bag, but he said you needed to learn a lesson about respect." I looked at her completely unbothered. "I am doing just fine, Brittany," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "You certainly look like you are enjoying your morning." "I am enjoying my life," she corrected, tossing her hair over her shoulder. She held up her hand, making sure the overhead lights caught the facets of her massive new diamond ring. Trey and I decided to do a little early celebrating. After all, we are signing the paperwork for the $15 million sale at noon today. We are finally getting what we deserve. No more living in the shadow of your stubborn grandmother and her outdated ideas about preserving history. We are moving into a luxury penthouse and leaving all this ghetto family drama behind us. Her casual microaggression and blatant disrespect for the woman who had built the very wealth she was currently trying to steal made my stomach turn. But I did not raise my voice. I did not react emotionally. I simply looked at the ring on her finger. I knew that the $2 million loan they had taken out was secured by their own house. I knew the interest rate was a staggering 30%. They were spending money they did not have based on a real estate deal that was never going to happen. The barista called my name and placed my black espresso on the counter. He then called Brittany's name and set down her massive iced drink. I reached into my purse and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. I handed it to the barista. "Keep the change," I told him. "And pay for her drink, too." Brittany scoffed, looking highly offended. "I do not need your charity, Harper," she snapped, crossing her arms. "I am about to be a millionaire. You are the one who is going to be begging us for a handout by tomorrow morning." I picked up my small cup of espresso. I took a slow sip, savoring the bitter taste. I looked Brittany dead in the eye and let the silence stretch out until she started to look uncomfortable. "I am not offering charity, Brittany," I said, my voice dropping to a chillingly calm whisper. "I am offering my condolences." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" she demanded, her face flushing red with anger. I looked down at her hand one last time. "You should really enjoy that new diamond ring," I told her. "Take lots of pictures of it today. Because once that real estate deal falls through at noon and your $2 million shadow loan defaults, it will be the only thing the bank does not repossess. Although I doubt a pawn shop will give you even half of what you paid for it." Brittany's jaw dropped. Her eyes widened in pure shock as the words fully registered. "How do you—" she stammered, taking a step back. "Have a beautiful morning, Brittany," I said, turning my back on her. As I walked toward the glass doors, I heard a frustrated scream behind me, followed by the sound of plastic shattering. Brittany had thrown her massive iced coffee straight at my head, but her aim was as poor as her financial planning. The drink smashed against the wall, completely missing me. I pushed the door open and walked out into the morning sunlight, feeling nothing but absolute anticipation for the bloodbath that was about to take place in the boardroom. I got into my car and drove straight to my corporate office in the financial district. My firm occupied the entire top floor of a sleek glass building overlooking the city skyline. When I stepped out of the elevator, my team was already hard at work analyzing data sets and tracking offshore accounts for our corporate clients. I walked past the glass-walled conference rooms and went straight into my private office, locking the heavy door behind me. I had already sent the preliminary evidence to my contact at the FBI, but in my line of work, preliminary was never enough. I wanted to build a financial cage so tight that my father and brother would not even be able to breathe, let alone lie their way out of it. I sat down at my desk and woke up my custom-built workstation. 3 massive curved monitors flared to life, casting a cool blue glow across the dark wood of my desk. I opened the encrypted folder containing the forged quitclaim deed my father had filed with the county. The document looked incredibly authentic at first glance. It had my grandmother's forged signature, a raised notary seal, and the official county recording stamps. But a forensic accountant does not look at the paper. We look at the metadata. We look at the digital fingerprints left behind by greedy people who think they are smarter than the system. I started with the notary public who had stamped the fraudulent deed. The stamp bore the name of a man named Marcus Vance. I ran his name through the state licensing database and cross-referenced it with the disciplinary records from the State Bar Association. It took less than 5 minutes to find the massive glaring hole in my father's master plan. Marcus Vance was not a legitimate notary. His license had been permanently revoked 3 years ago after he was caught taking bribes to falsify property lines for a corrupt housing developer. He was a disgraced ghost operating in the shadows and charging desperate people exorbitant fees to stamp fake documents. But proving the notary was a fraud was only half the battle. I needed to prove that my father knew he was a fraud and actively paid him for the illegal service. In financial investigations, money is the loudest witness in the room. Money never lies, and it always leaves a highly visible trail. I opened a secure terminal and accessed the clearinghouse records for the county banking system. I knew from my late-night investigation that Trey and Brittany had taken out a $2 million loan from a shadow lender. That shadow lender was not some forgiving local credit union. They were a notorious private equity group that operated on the absolute fringes of the law. They specialized in predatory lending, using aggressive asset seizure tactics the moment a single payment was missed. Trey had practically handed them the deed to his own house on a silver platter just to get the cash advance. That money was deposited into Trey's primary checking account exactly 2 weeks ago. I brought up the ledger for that specific account and started tracking the outflows. My brother was incredibly careless. He and my father were so blinded by the promise of a $15 million payday that they did not even try to wash the funds through secondary accounts. 4 days after the $2 million loan hit his account, Trey initiated a direct wire transfer for exactly $50,000. The recipient was listed under a dummy shell company called Vantage Point Consulting. I typed the name of the shell company into my terminal and ran a deep web script to pierce the corporate veil. It is a complex algorithmic process that strips away the layers of anonymous business filings to reveal the actual human being who registered the entity. The script ran for about 40 seconds, pulling data from tax registries and offshore banking nodes. When the final result popped up on my center screen, I actually smiled. The registered agent for the shell company was none other than Marcus Vance. My brother had wired $50,000 of borrowed loan shark money directly to a disgraced notary just days before a forged quitclaim deed miraculously appeared in the county property records. It was a straight, undeniable line of criminal conspiracy. But I wanted more. I wanted to tie my father directly to the physical act of the forgery to ensure he could not blame it all on Trey. I pinged the IP address that was used to log into the county portal when the fake deed was electronically submitted. The county server logs are public record if you know which digital door to knock on and how to bypass the basic firewalls. I pulled the exact login timestamp and traced the IP address back through the network routing hubs. The ping bounced off a few local cell towers before settling firmly on a residential broadband account. I cross-referenced the account holder name and the physical billing address associated with that internet provider. It was my father's home internet connection. He had literally uploaded the forged federal document from his own living room using his own personal computer. The sheer arrogance of it was staggering. He truly believed that because my grandmother was an elderly black woman, nobody would look twice at the sudden transfer of her massive estate. He thought the legal system would just rubber stamp his theft because he was the loud, demanding man of the house. He never considered that his own daughter possessed the exact skill set required to dismantle his entire life keystroke by keystroke. I compiled the wire transfer receipts, the revoked notary license records, and the IP address server logs into a single master presentation file. I labeled it the Odessa Portfolio. I printed 3 hard copies on thick premium paper and bound them in sleek black leather folders. 1 folder for me, 1 folder for Julian, and 1 folder to slide across the mahogany table directly to the federal agents. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and took a deep, steadying breath. My phone buzzed quietly on the desk. It was a text message from Julian, confirming that the FBI white-collar task force was already getting into position at the developer's corporate office. The board meeting was scheduled for noon. It was currently 10:30 in the morning. I stood up, smoothed out the wrinkles in my emerald green suit, and picked up my heavy leather briefcase. For my entire life, my father had told me I was useless. My brother had treated me like a servant who was beneath his notice. My sister-in-law had treated me like absolute trash. They had mistaken my quiet observation for weakness and my independence for isolation. They were about to learn that the girl they banished to the background had spent her entire life studying the architecture of their inevitable collapse. I walked out of my office and headed for the elevator, knowing the trap was fully set. It was time to go to a meeting. I stepped out of my private office and took the elevator down to the secure parking garage where Julian was already waiting in his town car with the engine running. I slid into the soft leather passenger seat and placed my heavy briefcase on the floorboard. Before Julian could even pull out of the parking structure, my encrypted tablet chimed with a high-priority emergency alert. I had set up an automated tracking script on the county registry database the night before just in case my father tried any last-minute desperate maneuvers. But the alert flashing on my screen was not triggered by Elijah. It was a new corporate filing from the shadow lender. Julian noticed the sudden shift in my expression as I stared at the glowing blue screen. "What is it?" he asked, merging the large car into the heavy late-morning traffic. I tapped the screen, rapidly opening the newly filed digital document and scanning the dense legal jargon. "It seems my brother is even more desperate and reckless than I originally thought," I said, my voice tight with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "The private equity syndicate that loaned Trey and Brittany the $2 million just filed a preliminary commercial lien." Julian frowned, navigating a sharp turn onto the main avenue. "A lien on Trey's personal house?" he asked, sounding unconcerned. "That is standard operating procedure for a high-risk shadow loan. They always secure their collateral before a major transaction." I shook my head and zoomed in on the property description attached to the filing. "No, Julian," I replied, feeling a cold knot of fury tighten in my chest. "They did not just place a lien on Trey's house. They filed a cross-collateralization claim against Grandma Odessa's entire historic estate." Julian let out a low, sharp breath. "That is incredibly dangerous, Harper," he warned, his professional demeanor instantly shifting into high alert. "If that syndicate successfully attaches a lien to the estate, it could tie up your blind trust in messy civil litigation for years. Those shadow lenders have bottomless pockets and an army of vicious lawyers. They do not care if the original deed your father used was forged. They will drag you through the mud and cloud the title of your property just to force a massive cash settlement." I quickly began running a secondary trace on the loan contract that Trey had signed with the syndicate. My brother had used the forged quitclaim deed to convince the loan sharks that he was the legal heir and had the ultimate authority to pledge the commercial property as secondary backing for his cash advance. The loan sharks knew the $15 million sale was scheduled to close at noon today. They were filing the lien this morning as a hostile insurance policy to guarantee they got their massive payout directly from the escrow account before Trey could run off with the money. But as I read through the fine print of the loan agreement, a new layer of the conflict revealed itself. The sheer stupidity of his actions was almost hard to comprehend. I read the terms aloud to Julian so he could understand exactly what we were walking into. The loan was structured with a terrifying acceleration clause. It stated that if the primary asset, which was the $15 million sale, failed to close by 5 o'clock today, the entire $2 million principal plus a 50% penalty fee would become due immediately. Not next month and not next week. Today. And if Trey defaulted, the syndicate had the legal right to seize his personal home within 24 hours without going through a standard foreclosure process. "He literally signed his life away," I whispered, staring at his digital signature at the bottom of the screen. He was so blinded by the greed of getting his hands on Odessa's money that he did not even read the trap he was walking into. And the worst part was looking at the ledger of how Trey and Brittany had actually spent the money over the last 2 weeks. They had borrowed $2 million ostensibly to pay the fake notary and cover the expensive closing costs for the fraudulent sale. But the data showed a completely different story. The $50,000 bribe to Marcus Vance was just a drop in the bucket. The rest of the money had been systematically drained in a massive tidal wave of luxury spending. Brittany had gone on an absolute rampage. The 4-carat diamond ring I saw her wearing at the coffee shop earlier was just the beginning. The ledger showed wire transfers to high-end car dealerships for 2 luxury SUVs. There were massive charges at designer boutiques, non-refundable deposits, placed on a luxury penthouse overlooking the city, and a 6-month lease paid up front for a private yacht charter in the Caribbean. "They have already spent almost all of it," I told Julian, scrolling through the endless pages of reckless transactions. "The money is completely gone. They do not have the cash to pay the syndicate back when the real estate deal collapses today. They are going to be ruined." Julian steered the car toward the towering glass and steel skyscraper of the financial district. He did not look sympathetic in the slightest. "Good," he said, his voice hard and uncompromising. "Play stupid games and win stupid prizes. But we need to make sure that dirty lien does not stick to your trust." I smiled a sharp, predatory smile. Do not worry about the lien, Julian, I said, tapping the screen one last time to download the syndicate corporate charter. The shadow lender made one fatal mistake when they filed this claim. In their rush to secure the money, they used a digital routing number that connects back to an unregistered offshore shell account. I just forwarded their entire loan packet, including their illegal offshore routing data, directly to my contact at the FBI White Collar Division. By the time we walk into that boardroom, the federal agents will not just be arresting my father for document forgery. They will be seizing the shadow lender's assets for international money laundering and freezing the lien before it can even be officially recorded by the county clerk. I turned off the tablet and slipped it securely back into my leather tote bag. The panic and absolute chaos that Trey and Brittany were about to experience was going to be biblical. They had tried to sell my grandmother's legacy to the devil, but I had just locked the devil out of the building. We pulled up to the sleek headquarters of the commercial developer. The bright noon sun reflected off the revolving glass doors. I stepped out of the car, gripping the handle of my heavy leather briefcase. The traps were set, the digital evidence was bulletproof, and my toxic family was waiting on the top floor, completely unaware that their entire world was about to end. I stepped through the heavy, revolving glass doors, and the cool air conditioning of the developer headquarters washed over me. Julian gestured toward the private executive elevators at the far end of the lobby, but he paused. We were 30 minutes early for the noon meeting. He pointed to the upscale artisan cafe nestled in the corner of the massive marble atrium and suggested we wait there so the federal agents upstairs could finish getting into position. I agreed, needing a moment to mentally prepare for the fallout. The cafe was mostly empty except for a few corporate types in expensive suits. But as we walked toward the espresso counter, a loud, obnoxious laugh echoed through the quiet space. I froze. Sitting at a high-top table near the floor-to-ceiling windows was Brittany. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her entire world was about to crumble. She was sipping a sparkling water and talking animatedly to a young junior associate from the real estate firm who looked like he was desperately trying to escape the conversation. I stayed out of her line of sight, standing behind a large potted palm tree. I could hear every single word she was saying. Brittany was holding her left hand up in the air, deliberately catching the sunlight to show off the massive 4-carat diamond ring she had bought with dirty money. "It is just such a relief to finally liquidate that old property," Brittany told the uncomfortable associate. "My husband's family means well, but they have absolutely no idea how to manage generational wealth. You know how it is with them. They get a little piece of land, and they just hoard it. They let it fall apart because they do not have the vision to develop it properly. It is honestly sad how holding on to the past holds them back." The junior associate nodded politely, shifting his weight. "It took so much convincing to get my father-in-law to finally sell." Brittany continued, her voice dripping with condescension. "I had to make them see that a historical black neighborhood is not going to yield high returns. I mean, it is just a bunch of rundown buildings. By selling to your firm, we are finally stepping into the modern world. I plan on taking the $15 million and putting it into luxury condos in Buckhead. You know, places where the right kind of people actually want to live." My blood ran completely cold. I had always known Brittany was a gold digger, but hearing her openly disrespect my grandmother and my culture to a stranger was a new level of vile. She was sitting there dripping in diamonds paid for by a shadow loan, making racist microaggressions about the very people whose legacy she was actively trying to steal. She viewed my grandmother's lifetime of struggle and triumph as nothing more than a dusty stepping stone for her own white privilege. Odessa had fought through redlining discrimination and predatory lenders to build her commercial empire. She had created safe spaces for Black-owned businesses to thrive when no bank would give them a loan. And here was Brittany reducing all of that blood and sweat to a punchline about poor asset management. I stepped out from behind the palm tree and walked directly toward her table. Julian stayed back near the counter, letting me handle the confrontation. The junior associate looked relieved as I approached, but Brittany stopped mid-sentence. Her smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning with double the arrogance. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Brittany sneered, crossing her legs. I thought security would have escorted you off the premises by now, Harper. Are you here to beg for a job? I hear they need people to clean the floors after we sign the paperwork. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the table right next to her sparkling water. I did not raise my voice. I kept my posture perfectly straight. I am not here to beg, Brittany, I said quietly. I just happened to overhear your conversation about generational wealth. It is fascinating to hear your perspective on asset management, considering you do not actually have any assets to manage. Brittany's face flushed a deep, angry red. She slammed her hand down on the table, making the diamond ring clink loudly against the glass. I am about to walk upstairs and sign a contract for $15 million, she hissed, leaning in close. Trey and I are the future of this family. We are taking the money and leaving all of you behind, so do not sit there and act like you are better than me just because you have a fancy office job. I looked at her ring. It was gaudy and completely lacking in class, much like the woman wearing it. It is a beautiful ring, I said, my voice dangerously calm. It is a shame you had to take out a high-interest shadow loan against your own house just to afford the down payment. Brittany gasped and pulled her hand back as if the diamond had suddenly burned her skin. She looked around frantically to see if the junior associate had heard me, but he had already scurried away. "How do you know about that?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "I know everything, Brittany," I replied, leaning forward so she had to look me directly in the eyes. "I know you and Trey borrowed $2 million from a predatory syndicate. I know you spent almost all of it on luxury cars, clothes, and that ridiculous ring. And I know you did it all based on the assumption that you are going to get a massive payout at noon today." She swallowed hard but tried to recover her arrogant facade. "You are just jealous," she spat venomously. "You are trying to scare me because you know you lost. Elijah has the deed. We have the developer. The deal is done." I stood up and picked up my briefcase. I looked down at her with nothing but absolute pity. "You really should have paid more attention to the family you married into, Brittany," I said softly. "Because if you had, you would have known that my grandmother was a genius. And she made sure that her generational wealth would never end up in the hands of someone as careless and hateful as you." I turned and walked away toward the executive elevators, where Julian was waiting. I did not look back, but I could hear the shaky, erratic breaths coming from her table. The seed of absolute terror had been planted in her mind. She finally realized that something was horribly wrong, but she was already entirely too late to stop it. Julian was waiting for me by the polished steel doors of the executive elevator bank. He had watched the entire interaction from a distance, his face an unreadable mask of professional calm. I walked toward him, feeling the adrenaline humming beneath my skin. I had just planted a massive psychological landmine in my sister-in-law's head, and I knew it was only a matter of seconds before she completely detonated. My prediction was entirely accurate. Before I could even reach out to press the call button for the elevator, I heard the sharp, aggressive clicking of expensive high heels charging across the marble floor behind me. "Harper, wait!" Brittany shrieked, causing several corporate executives in the lobby to stop and stare. She closed the distance between us, her face contorted into an ugly mask of sheer panic and defensive rage. She had left her luxury shopping bags at the table, but she was still clutching her tall glass of sparkling water. "You think you can just walk in here and threaten me?" she yelled, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You are nothing but a jealous, bitter nobody. You are making up lies about shadow loans because you cannot stand the fact that Trey and I are about to be rich. You are bluffing, Harper." I slowly turned around to face her. The sheer desperation radiating from her was almost pathetic. She knew I was telling the truth. People who are confident in their financial stability do not chase people across lobbies screaming about their wealth. I did not say a single word. I simply looked at her with an expression of complete indifference. My silence infuriated her even more. In a sudden violent flash of temper, Brittany reared her hand back and threw her heavy glass of sparkling water directly at me. Julian stepped forward instantly, but I did not even flinch. I simply shifted my weight to the side. The glass flew past my shoulder and shattered loudly against the brushed steel of the elevator doors. cold water and sharp shards of glass rained down across the pristine marble floor. A collective gasp echoed through the lobby. A security guard started walking briskly toward us, his hand resting on his radio. I held up my hand to the guard, signaling that I had the situation completely under control. I calmly opened my leather tote bag and reached inside my wallet. I pulled out a crisp $100 bill. A young lobby attendant with a cleaning cart had frozen nearby, staring at the shattered glass. I walked over and gently pressed the $100 bill into his hand. For the mess, I told him quietly, "Thank you for your hard work." I then turned back to Brittany, who was standing there breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she realized the magnitude of the scene she had just caused. I looked down at the massive diamond ring sparkling on her shaking hand. "Enjoy the ring, Brittany," I said, my voice dropping to a chillingly calm pitch that only she could hear. "It will be the only thing the bank does not repossess." The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The steel doors slid open behind me. I turned my back on her, leaving her standing in a puddle of her own mess. Julian and I stepped into the elevator cabin. I pressed the button for the top floor. As the heavy doors slowly closed, I saw Brittany collapse onto a nearby lobby bench, burying her face in her hands. The elevator ascended rapidly, smoothly, leaving the chaos of the lobby far below us. The cabin was completely silent, except for the soft hum of the cables. Julian looked over at me and straightened his tie. That was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He remarked, his tone respectful. "She will be a nervous wreck by the time she walks into that boardroom. She will probably make a mistake before Elijah even has the chance to present the forged deed." I kept my eyes fixed on the digital floor indicator, watching the numbers climb higher and higher. "I want her to be terrified, Julian," I replied coldly. "I want all of them to be terrified. For my entire life, they made me feel small and insignificant. They made my grandmother feel like her legacy was a burden. They are about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate the quiet one in the room." Julian nodded and opened his leather briefcase. He pulled out the finalized trust documents bound in thick black covers. "Everything is in order," he confirmed. "The FBI agents are already in the adjoining observation room. The trap is completely sealed." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settling over me. As a forensic accountant, I was used to exposing white-collar criminals and corporate frauds. But this was different. This was my own blood. I was about to walk into a room and permanently sever the ties to the family that had raised me. Yet standing there in the ascending elevator, I felt absolutely no guilt. I only felt a profound sense of duty to protect the empire that Odessa had built with her bare hands. The empire that was rightfully mine. The elevator finally slowed to a halt. The doors slid open, revealing the opulent penthouse level of the commercial developer. The floors were covered in plush dark carpets, and the walls were lined with expensive modern art. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city of Atlanta. Somewhere down there in the sprawling metropolis was the historic estate my grandmother had fought so hard to preserve. A sleek mahogany reception desk sat in the center of the room. The receptionist stood up immediately, flashing a highly polished corporate smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pierce," she said, addressing Julian. "The chairman is expecting you. He is currently waiting in the main glass boardroom. Your other guests have not arrived upstairs just yet." Julian thanked her and gestured for me to lead the way. We walked down a long, quiet corridor lined with frosted glass walls. I could see the faint outlines of people moving inside the various offices, but my focus was entirely on the double doors at the very end of the hall. This was the exact room where my father believed he was going to become a multi-million-dollar real estate mogul. I stopped just outside the doors and pulled out my encrypted phone one last time. I had a secure message waiting from Agent Miller, the lead federal investigator on the white-collar task force. The message was short and highly satisfying. It read, "Marcus Vance is in custody and cooperating fully. We have the audio feed active in the boardroom. Proceed when ready." I locked my phone and slipped it into my pocket. My brother had wired dirty money to a disgraced notary, and my father had uploaded forged federal documents from his living room. The evidence was irrefutable. I looked at Julian and gave him a single sharp nod. I reached out and placed my hand firmly on the cool metal handle of the boardroom door. This was the point of no return. Once I walked through these doors, the illusion of our family would be shattered forever. There would be no more fake holiday dinners, no more passive-aggressive comments, and no more pretending that we were anything other than a victim and her abusers. I thought about the teenager whose credit was destroyed by her own father. I took one final deep breath, pushed the heavy doors open, and stepped into the room, ready to execute the perfect financial takedown. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and stepped into the massive glass boardroom. The space was intimidating by design. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city skyline. A long, polished wooden table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by plush leather chairs. Sitting at the far end of the table, looking like kings of a temporary castle, were my father Elijah and my brother Trey. They were both wearing expensive tailored suits that I knew they could not actually afford. A silver ice bucket sat on the table between them, holding a bottle of vintage champagne. They already had crystal glasses in their hands, celebrating a victory that was never going to arrive. Elijah looked up as the doors swung shut behind Julian and me. The smug, triumphant smile on his face grew even wider when he saw me standing there. He set his champagne glass down and leaned back in his leather chair, lacing his fingers together over his chest. He looked at me not with the love of a father, but with the gloating arrogance of a man who believed he had finally crushed his greatest nuisance. I knew exactly why he was smiling. He thought my presence in this room was a sign of my ultimate surrender. Earlier this morning, before the sun had even fully risen, a courier had knocked on the door of my apartment. The courier handed me a thick premium envelope sealed with a gold foil stamp. Inside the envelope was a formal invitation to this exact contract signing. It was printed on heavy, expensive cardstock with elegant cursive lettering. But the most important part of the invitation was not the location or the time. It was the handwritten note my father had scribbled across the bottom in thick black ink. The note was burned into my memory. It read, "Come watch your brother become a millionaire and learn how to respect your family." It was the ultimate insult. He did not invite me here to share in the wealth or to make amends for throwing me out of my grandmother's house. He invited me here to humiliate me. He wanted me to stand in the corner of this corporate boardroom and watch him hand over my inheritance to a stranger. He wanted to break my spirit completely and force me to acknowledge Trey as the new financial head of the family. I reached into the pocket of my emerald green suit jacket and pulled out that very same invitation. I walked slowly across the thick plush carpet, the sound of my heels muffled by the expensive fabric. I stopped right in front of the empty chair opposite my father. I placed the thick cardstock on the polished wood and slid it across the table until it rested right next to his champagne glass. "I received your invitation, Elijah," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "And I decided to take your advice. I am here to watch." Trey let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. He picked up his glass and took a large gulp of the expensive champagne. "I told you she would come crawling back," Trey said, looking at our father. "She knows she has nowhere else to go. You can stand by the wall, Harper, and watch how real business is done. Maybe if you keep your mouth shut and act respectful, I will let you manage one of my smaller rental properties." I looked at my brother, feeling a profound sense of second-hand embarrassment. He had absolutely no idea that he was standing on a trap door, and I was currently holding the lever. He was bragging about managing properties while carrying a $2 million shadow loan that was about to default in a matter of hours. His entire reality was built on a foundation of stolen documents and sheer stupidity. I did not move toward the wall. I stayed standing right at the edge of the boardroom table. Julian stepped up beside me, placing his heavy leather briefcase on the table with a dull thud. The sound seemed to break the celebratory atmosphere in the room. Elijah looked at Julian and frowned, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "I did not invite your lawyer." Elijah snapped, his voice losing some of its previous warmth. "This is a private family matter and a closed corporate meeting. The executives from the development firm will be here any minute, and I do not want any legal ambulance chasers complicating my sale. Tell him to wait in the lobby, Harper." Julian did not even blink. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his phone, placing it face up on the table next to the briefcase. He tapped the screen once. I knew he was verifying the audio connection with the federal agents in the adjacent room. "I am not here as a guest, Elijah," Julian said, his tone completely flat and professional. "I am here representing the sole legal owner of the Odessa estate. And I highly recommend you keep your voice down, because every single word spoken in this room is currently being recorded for official record." Elijah scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "You are bluffing," he said, but I could hear a slight tremor of uncertainty in his voice. "You have no power here. I have the quitclaim deed signed by my mother. I have the notary seal. The developer's legal team already reviewed the preliminary scans and approved the purchase. You cannot stop this, Harper. You are just a bitter little girl who cannot handle the fact that she was left out of the will." I placed my hands flat on the cool mahogany table and leaned forward. The air in the room grew heavy and suffocating. The absolute confidence in my posture made Trey stop drinking his champagne. "I am not here to stop the sale, Elijah," I said, looking directly into his eyes. "I am here to facilitate it. You wanted me to watch my brother become a millionaire, but what you failed to realize is that you do not own the land you are trying to sell. You never did. You forged a federal document using a disgraced notary, and you thought you could outsmart the entire financial system." The color began to drain from my father's face. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form a single word, the boardroom doors swung open once again. 3 executives wearing immaculate dark suits walked into the room. They were the senior partners of the real estate development firm. But they did not walk toward my father. They walked directly toward me. The lead executive, a tall man with silver hair, stopped next to my chair and offered a slight, respectful bow. "Good afternoon, boss," he said, addressing me loud and clear. "The final acquisition contracts are ready for your signature whenever you are ready to terminate the fraudulent sellers." The crystal champagne glass slipped from Trey's hand and shattered against the floor. The trap was finally sprung. Elijah looked back and forth between me and the silver-haired executive. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. "What did you just call her?" Elijah demanded, his voice trembling with a sudden, overwhelming fear. The executive straightened his expensive suit jacket and looked at my father with polite disgust. "I called her boss," he replied smoothly, stepping back to stand in line with my position. "Harper is the majority shareholder and chief executive officer of the parent company that acquired our development firm last month. She owns this building, she owns this firm, and she is the sole decision-maker for all commercial acquisitions." Trey staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes crunching loudly on the broken glass. "That is impossible," he stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of pale gray. "You are just a data analyst, Harper. You do not have the money to buy a massive corporate development firm. You live in a basic apartment and you play with spreadsheets." I looked at my older brother, feeling a wave of absolute triumph wash over me. "I am a forensic accountant, Trey," I corrected him, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I track missing money for a living. And when you are very good at tracking billions of dollars for global corporations, you learn exactly how to invest your own capital." While you and Elijah were sitting around Grandma's house complaining about how unfair life was, I was working 80-hour weeks. I built a property technology startup 5 years ago. We specialized in identifying undervalued commercial zones and utilizing algorithmic data to outbid traditional developers. My startup became wildly successful. And exactly 30 days ago, my board of directors approved the hostile takeover of the very real estate conglomerate you are currently sitting inside. I walked slowly around the polished mahogany table, letting my words sink into their greedy little minds. I needed to make sure they understood the absolute magnitude of their failure. They needed to know that every single move they made had been monitored and anticipated. "Earlier this morning, before I even stepped foot in that coffee shop to warn your foolish wife, I had a very important meeting," I told them. I walked into the federal building downtown at 8 o'clock sharp. I sat down with Julian and a specialized white-collar crime task force from the FBI. Elijah gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning completely white. FBI, he whispered the word, catching painfully in his throat. Yes, Elijah, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I replied, stopping right next to his leather chair. I did not just give them an anonymous tip. I handed them a fully indexed prosecution file. I gave them the complete digital footprint of your entire fraudulent operation. You see, when Julian and I realized you were trying to use a forged quitclaim deed to sell Grandma's estate, we knew we had to let you dig your own grave. I instructed my acquisition team here at the developer office to play along. I told them to accept your fake documents and schedule this massive contract signing. We created the perfect illusion, so you would voluntarily walk into a federal trap. Trey was breathing heavily, his eyes darting wildly around the room looking for an exit that did not exist. You set us up, he accused, pointing a shaking finger at me. You deliberately let us take out that $2 million shadow loan. You wanted us to go into debt. I did not force you to take dirty money from loan sharks, Trey. I countered, my voice hard and unforgiving. You did that all on your own because you were blinded by greed and entitlement. You were so desperate to steal from your own family that you literally handed over the deed to your personal home as collateral. All I did was make sure the FBI was watching when you wired $50,000 of that dirty money to Marcus Vance. At the mention of the disgraced notary, my father finally collapsed backward into his chair. All the arrogant energy completely drained out of his body, leaving him looking small and incredibly old. He knew that name. He knew exactly what it meant to hear me say it out loud. Marcus Vance is currently sitting in a federal interrogation room. I continued leaning down so I was eye level with my father. The task force picked him up 2 hours ago. He was very eager to cut a plea deal to save himself. He told the agents everything, Elijah. He told them exactly how much you paid him to backdate the notary stamp on that fake quitclaim deed. He even provided them with the text messages you sent him from your personal phone, complaining about how long it was taking to process the fake paperwork. Elijah closed his eyes, a single bead of sweat rolling down the side of his face. You are lying, he muttered weakly, but there was no conviction in his tone. You cannot prove any of this, Harper. I smiled a cold, predatory smile. I do not have to prove anything, Elijah, I said, standing back up. Agent Miller and his team already verified the wire transfer receipts, the county server logs, and the offshore routing data from the predatory lending syndicate you partnered with. The FBI task force spent the entire morning freezing the shadow lender's assets and invalidating the cross-collateralization lien you tried to place on my grandmother's property. You brought a cheap forgery to a $15 million corporate acquisition, and you tried to sell my own legacy directly back to me. The silver-haired executive stepped forward and placed a thick file folder on the table directly in front of my father. As per company policy and federal regulations, we are formally declining your offer to sell, he stated professionally. Furthermore, we have already surrendered all the forged documents you submitted to the federal authorities waiting next door. Trey let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. He grabbed his hair, pulling at the roots in sheer panic. The loan, he gasped, looking at our father with wild, desperate eyes. The loan defaults at 5 o'clock today, Elijah. If we do not have the $15 million, they are going to take my house. They are going to take everything and leave Brittany and me on the street. She is going to divorce me, Elijah. She is going to leave me. Elijah did not look at his son. He just stared blankly at the polished mahogany table, finally understanding that he had been completely outmatched. He thought he was the apex predator swooping in to steal the ultimate prize. He never realized he was just the prey being carefully herded into a slaughterhouse of his own making. I picked up my emerald green suit jacket from the back of my chair and smoothed the lapels. I looked at the two men who had tormented me, dismissed me, and tried to ruin my life. They were utterly broken. The illusion of their superiority was shattered permanently. Julian checked his luxury watch and looked over at me. The task force is ready, boss, he said, using the title naturally. I nodded and turned my back on my father and brother. It is time to bring them in, I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet boardroom. Let the FBI do their job. to fully appreciate the absolute devastation that washed over my family when the FBI finally moved in. You have to understand exactly what they were doing in the moments before I revealed myself. Before Julian and I walked through those heavy mahogany doors, we spent 20 minutes standing in the darkened observation room next door. The wall dividing us from the main boardroom was a massive panel of two-way glass. We could see everything, and through the hidden microphones, we could hear every single arrogant breath they took. Agent Miller and his task force were standing right behind me, adjusting their tactical gear and listening to the audio feed. The boardroom was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. It belonged to the high-end legal division of my real estate conglomerate. The table was carved from a single slab of imported marble. The chairs were stitched from soft Italian leather. It was the kind of room designed to make ordinary people feel incredibly small. But my father Elijah and my brother Trey did not feel small. They felt invincible. They strutted around that boardroom as if they had built the entire skyscraper with their own bare hands. Elijah was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car. He had a fresh haircut and a silk pocket square folded perfectly into his chest pocket. Trey was pacing nervously near the floor-to-ceiling windows wearing a bright blue designer blazer and constantly checking a massive gold watch on his wrist. I knew exactly why he kept checking the time. The shadow loan he took out to pay for their fake documents was set to default at 5 o'clock. Every passing minute brought him closer to total financial ruin. Brittany was the worst of them all. My sister-in-law was sitting at the head of the marble table wearing a tight white cocktail dress that was completely inappropriate for a morning business meeting. She was practically blinded by the glare of the 4-carat diamond ring she had bought on credit. A silver ice bucket sat in the middle of the table holding a bottle of vintage champagne. Brittany had already popped the cork without asking for permission. She poured a generous glass for herself and then filled glasses for Elijah and Trey. They were celebrating a victory they had not even earned. I watched through the glass as Brittany held up her crystal flute. To the future, she announced, her voice echoing through the hidden speakers in our observation room. No more dusty old houses, and no more pretending to care about preserving history. Tonight, we celebrate in a penthouse. Elijah clinked his glass against hers and took a long swallow. He looked across the table at the director of acquisitions. The director was a seasoned executive with silver hair and a completely unreadable expression. He was sitting calmly with his hands folded over a thick leather portfolio. The portfolio contained the forged quitclaim deed my father had submitted. "Well," Elijah said, setting his glass down forcefully on the marble table, "we have been sitting here for 20 minutes. The documents have been submitted, and the title has been cleared on our end. My mother is dead, and the estate is mine. $15 million was the agreed-upon purchase price. I want the wire transfer initiated immediately. My son and I have very important investments to make before the banks close today." Trey walked over and stood next to his father, nodding in agreement. He wiped a thin layer of sweat from his forehead. "Yes, we need the funds released now." Trey added, his voice tight with anxiety. "We provided the notary stamps and the quitclaim deed. There is absolutely no reason for this delay. Wire the money into my primary account right now so we can conclude this business." I watched the silver-haired director lean back in his chair. He was playing his part perfectly, just as I had instructed him. He looked at the forged deed, and then looked at my father with a polite but firm expression. "I understand your urgency, gentlemen," the director said smoothly. "However, an acquisition of this magnitude cannot simply be pushed through with a single keystroke. $15 million requires final executive authorization. We have reviewed your quitclaim deed and the notary signature. Everything has been processed by our legal department, but we must wait for the chairman's final signature." Elijah frowned, his face turning a dark shade of red. "The chairman," he repeated angrily. "You told us on the phone yesterday that you had the authority to close this deal. I am not sitting here all day waiting for some invisible corporate boss to sign a piece of paper. I am the owner of that land. You have my signature, And that is the only one that matters. Transfer the money. The director did not flinch. He simply placed his hands flat on the table. The chairman owns the majority shares of this conglomerate, Elijah. The chairman personally requested to review the chain of title for this specific historic property before releasing the $15 million. The signature is mandatory. If you are unwilling to wait, we can simply cancel the acquisition right now, and you can take your property elsewhere. Panic flashed across Trey's face. No, he blurted out quickly, waving his hands. No, we are not canceling anything. We will wait. We will wait for the chairman. Brittany rolled her eyes and took another sip of champagne. This is ridiculous, she muttered. Just another corporate ego trip. Whoever this chairman is, they better hurry up. I have a fitting at a bridal boutique this afternoon to look for anniversary dresses, and I refuse to be late. Elijah sat back down heavily, crossing his arms over his expensive suit. Fine, he snapped. Tell your chairman to get down here, but I want the wire routing numbers typed in and ready to go the second the ink dries. Standing in the dark observation room, I felt a cold smile spread across my face. Agent Miller looked over at me and gave a small nod indicating that they had enough audio evidence of intent to defraud. They had explicitly demanded the $15 million while acknowledging the forged documents. The trap was perfectly primed. I looked at Julian. It is time, I whispered. We walked out of the observation room and down the short carpeted hallway toward the main boardroom doors. I had timed my entrance perfectly. They were sitting in there drinking stolen champagne and demanding the presence of the chairman so they could steal my grandmother's legacy. They wanted the chairman. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and they swung wide with a loud thud that instantly silenced the room. I walked in first, wearing my tailored emerald green power suit. Julian stepped in right beside me carrying his leather briefcase. But it was the two men walking in directly behind us that made the air in the boardroom turn to ice. They were wearing tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across the chest. Agent Miller and his partner stepped into the room and immediately took up positions by the exit, blocking anyone from leaving. The crystal champagne flute slipped out of Brittany's hand and shattered on the marble table, sending expensive alcohol spilling over the polished surface. Elijah stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the floor. Trey just stared, his jaw hanging open in pure confusion. Brittany was the first to find her voice. "Security!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "What is she doing here? I told you to keep her out. Get security up here right now and throw this trespasser out of the building. She is trying to ruin our deal." The silver-haired director of acquisitions did not reach for the phone. He did not call for security. Instead, he slowly stood up from his chair. He buttoned his suit jacket and turned his back on my father. He faced me and offered a deep, respectful bow. "Good afternoon, boss," he said, his voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "Everything is ready. The fraudulent documents have been secured and we are simply waiting for your final orders." The silence that followed those words was deafening. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. Elijah froze completely, his hand hovering over the table. Trey looked like he was going to be physically sick. Brittany's face drained of all color, her mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out. Their brains were desperately trying to process the impossible reality standing right in front of them. The sister they had bullied, the daughter they had discarded. The woman they thought was a nobody was actually the chairman of the very conglomerate they were trying to scam. I walked slowly past the spilled champagne and took the empty chair at the head of the boardroom. Julian stood to my right, placing his briefcase on the table. I looked at my father and smiled. "You demanded to see the chairman, Elijah," I said, my voice soft but laced with pure venom. "Well, here I am. I apologize for the delay, but I had to make sure the federal agents had enough time to listen to your entire confession through the hidden microphones." Trey shook his head frantically, backing away from the table. "No!" he stammered, his eyes darting wildly between me and the director. "This is a trick. This is some kind of sick joke. She does not own this company. She is just a data analyst. She lives in an apartment. The director looked at my brother with absolute pity. Mrs. Harper is the majority shareholder and chief executive officer of our parent company Trey, he explained calmly. She acquired this firm 30 days ago through her property technology startup. You have been negotiating with her employees this entire time. There is no corporate buyer for your grandmother's estate because Mrs. Harper already owns it. Elijah collapsed back into his chair as if his legs could no longer support his weight. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in him before. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the horrifying realization that he had walked blindly into a meticulously crafted trap. "You set us up," Elijah whispered, his voice trembling. "You brought us here just to humiliate us." "I did not set you up, Elijah," I replied, leaning forward and resting my hands on the cool marble. "You set yourself up the moment you decided to steal from Grandma Odessa. Did you really think you could forge a federal document using a disgraced notary like Marcus Vance and nobody would notice? Did you really think I would just step aside and let you sell my inheritance to fund Brittany's shopping addiction?" Brittany let out a loud sob, wrapping her arms around herself. She looked at the heavy diamond ring on her finger and then looked at the FBI agent standing by the door. The reality of the situation was finally breaking through her delusions of grandeur. "You were so desperate for a payday," I continued, my gaze shifting to Trey. "You took out a $2 million shadow loan and put your own house up as collateral. You demanded the wire transfer today because you knew your loan defaults at 5 o'clock. But there is no $15 million wire transfer, Trey. There never was. The money you spent is gone, and by tomorrow morning the syndicate is going to seize your home." Trey dropped to his knees right there on the boardroom floor. He buried his face in his hands and started to cry loudly. The golden child, the heir to the family legacy, was reduced to a sobbing mess in a custom-tailored suit. He had gambled his entire life on a stolen deed, and he had lost everything. Elijah reached out a shaking hand toward me. "Harper, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "You are my daughter. We are family. You cannot do this to your own blood. Please tell them to let us go. We will walk away, and you will never see us again. Just let us go." I looked at the man who had tormented me for 32 years. I felt absolutely no sympathy. I did not see a father. I saw a parasite who had finally been separated from his host. I stood up from the chair and looked down at him. "I am not your daughter, Elijah," I said, my voice echoing with finality. "And this meeting is adjourned," I nodded to Agent Miller. The FBI agent stepped forward, pulling heavy metal handcuffs from their tactical belts. The sound of the ratcheting metal filled the room as they reached for my father. "Wait," Julian said, raising his hand just a fraction. "Before you take him away, there is one last piece of business we need to officially enter into the corporate and federal record." I reached into my heavy leather tote bag and pulled out the thick stack of parchment papers I had retrieved from Julian's red wax-sealed envelope the night before. I walked slowly back over to the head of the marble table where Elijah's spilled champagne was still dripping steadily onto the plush carpet. I lifted the heavy documents high into the air and slammed them down onto the polished mahogany surface. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room, causing everyone to jump. Brittany shrieked and flinched backward in her leather chair. Trey kept his face buried in his hands, sobbing pathetically on the floor. Elijah just stared at the papers, his wrists already bound behind his back in cold, heavy steel. "What is that?" Elijah rasped his chest, heaving with sheer panic as he strained his neck to look at the documents. "This is the real reason you never had a chance," I said, sliding the first document across the marble table until it rested right in front of his face. It was the certificate of adoption with the raised gold seal of the state of Georgia pressed firmly into the corner. "Look at it, Elijah," I commanded, my voice hard and unforgiving. "Read the date. Read the signatures. 14 years ago, when you tried to destroy my credit and steal my future grandma, Odessa took you to court. She stripped you of your parental rights completely and permanently. You signed them away to avoid going to federal prison for identity theft." Elijah squeezed his eyes shut tightly, trying to turn his head away from the undeniable truth. but Agent Miller held him firmly by the shoulder, forcing him to face the paperwork. "I am not your daughter!" I declared, my voice ringing with absolute authority and echoing off the floor to ceiling windows. "Legally speaking, in the eyes of the state and the federal government, I am your sister. Grandma Odessa adopted me to protect me from you. You have no parental claim over me, and you certainly have no next of kin claim over her estate." Trey looked up from the floor, his eyes red and horribly swollen. "His sister," he repeated numbly, as if his brain could not process the simple words. "Yes, Trey," I said, looking down at him with utter disdain. "Which technically makes you my nephew. But the family tree is not the only thing Grandma Odessa rearranged to keep her legacy out of your greedy hands." I picked up the second stack of papers, which were bound in a thick blue legal cover. I dropped them right on top of the adoption certificate, slapping the heavy mahogany wood for emphasis. "This is the blind trust," I explained. "Odessa transferred every single asset she ever owned into this sovereign trust years ago. Her bank accounts, her investment portfolios, the historic house you kicked me out of yesterday, and this very commercial property you just tried to sell today. All of it belongs to the trust." Elijah stared at the blue cover, his breathing shallow and rapid like a trapped animal. "And you are the beneficiary," he choked out the words, scraping against his throat. "I am the sole beneficiary and the sole executor." I corrected him, leaning forward. "I have absolute control over every single dime and every single brick. Your fake death certificate and your forged quitclaim deed mean absolutely nothing, because Odessa did not even own the property when she died. The trust owned it. You brought a forged piece of paper to steal an estate that legally did not even exist in the probate system." The silver-haired director of acquisitions nodded respectfully from his side of the table. "Mrs. Harper provided these trust documents to our legal department this morning," he added, confirming the devastating reality for my family. "We verified the state seals and the complete chain of title. The $15 million purchase price you negotiated was completely null and void because you were attempting to sell an asset that was locked inside a highly secure financial vehicle." "You have absolutely nothing, Elijah," I said, leaning in so close he could smell the subtle scent of my expensive perfume. "You spent your entire life acting like you were the undisputed king of this family. You demanded respect, you demanded blind loyalty, and you constantly demanded money. You thought because you were the oldest male you were automatically entitled to everything Grandma Odessa built with her own blood, sweat, and tears. But she saw right through your fragile ego. She knew you were nothing but a parasite. She spent the last 14 years of her life building an impenetrable financial fortress to keep you out, and she handed me the only key." Brittany let out a miserable, wailing cry. She reached across the marble table, desperately trying to grab the trust documents, but Julian smoothly pulled them out of her reach and slipped them back into his briefcase. "We are family," Brittany cried, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "Harper, please, you have millions and millions of dollars. You own this entire corporate company. You can just pay off the shadow loan for us right now. It is only $2 million. It is nothing to you. If you do not pay it, they are going to take our house. They are going to take my cars and all my jewelry." I looked at my sister-in-law, feeling absolutely zero pity for the woman who had gleefully kicked a trash bag full of my clothes down the stairs just 24 hours ago. "I told you at the coffee shop, Brittany," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "Enjoy that diamond ring while you still can. You made your choices. You insulted my grandmother, you mocked my career, and you actively plotted to leave me homeless on the street. I do not owe you a single penny. You can go live in a cardboard box for all I care." Trey let out a raw, agonizing scream of pure frustration. He lunged forward, trying to grab his father's legs, but the second FBI agent easily pushed him back down to the carpet. "You ruined us!" Elijah Trey screamed, spitting the words at the man he had idolized and followed his entire life. "You said this was a guaranteed deal. You said the fake notary would work. You made me put my own house up for the shadow loan." "I did it for us!" Elijah shouted back, his voice cracking with intense desperation as the handcuffs bit into his wrists. "I was trying to get us what we rightfully deserved. She stole it from us, Trey. She stole my inheritance. Nobody stole anything from you, Elijah, I said, standing up straight and adjusting the lapels of my emerald green suit jacket. You threw it all away the very day you decided your own family was nothing more than a bank account waiting to be drained. You gambled with my future 14 years ago, and you lost. You gambled with Grandma's legacy today, and you lost again. The only difference is this time there is no one left to bail you out. Agent Miller tightened his firm grip on Elijah's shoulder and pulled him roughly to his feet. You have the right to remain silent. The federal agent began reading the Miranda rights in a deep, booming voice that echoed endlessly off the glass boardroom walls. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The sound of those familiar words, the ultimate confirmation of his absolute and total defeat, finally broke the last remaining shred of Elijah's pride. He slumped forward, his chin resting heavily on his chest, looking like an empty, broken shell of a man. The fake empire he had tried to build on a foundation of lies and blatant forgery had completely collapsed, crushing him underneath the immense weight of his own monumental greed. I stood there and watched my grandmother's final masterpiece of justice unfold, knowing that the estate and my future were finally safe forever. But Elijah was not ready to surrender to reality just yet. The heavy steel handcuffs were tight around his wrists, but his mind was still frantically searching for a loophole. He refused to believe that his master plan had entirely collapsed in front of the very people he had spent his life belittling. "Wait! There is a mistake!" Elijah screamed, his voice cracking with a desperate, grating pitch. He struggled against the grip of the federal agents, his expensive charcoal suit wrinkling horribly. "I am the victim here. I paid a licensed professional to handle that paperwork. I did not forge anything. Marcus Vance told me the deed was completely legitimate. I paid him in good faith to process the estate transfer." He looked wildly at Agent Miller, his chest heaving with exertion and panic. "Let me call him," Elijah begged. "Let me call his office right now. He will explain everything to you. He will tell you that the deed is valid and that Harper is the one lying to you. I have his direct office line saved right here on my phone. You have to let me make a phone call to clear my name before you arrest me. I am a respected businessman in this community." I looked at Julian, and we both almost laughed out loud at the sheer audacity of the man. My father was actually trying to throw his own co-conspirator under the bus to save his own skin. He thought he could spin a web of lies and convince the FBI that he was just a naive, grieving son who got scammed by a bad notary. It was the desperate flailing of a drowning man who refused to admit he had jumped off the boat on purpose. Agent Miller exchanged a knowing look with his partner. He reached into the pocket of Elijah's tailored suit jacket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. "You want to call him Miller?" asked his voice dangerously calm and professional. "All right, Elijah. We are all about finding the truth today. We will let you verify your story right now for the official record. Unlock your phone." Miller held the screen up to Elijah's face. The facial recognition scanned his sweating, panicked features, and the phone unlocked with a soft click. Agent Miller tapped the screen, navigating to the contacts, and put the phone on speaker. He set it down in the exact center of the massive marble boardroom table, right next to the puddle of spilled vintage champagne. He pressed the contact labeled Marcus Notary. The phone began to ring. The sound echoed loudly through the silent glass boardroom. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Elijah looked at me across the table with a desperate, triumphant gleam in his eye, as if this phone call was magically going to reverse the adoption, the blind trust, and the federal indictment all at once. He actually believed his hired criminal was going to answer the phone and lie to the FBI for him. But that pathetic little gleam of hope died the exact second the call connected. It was not the smooth, overly confident voice of Marcus Vance that answered the phone. It was a deep, authoritative voice with a thick Southern drawl and a completely no-nonsense tone. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Evidence Management, and Asset Forfeiture Division," the voice on the speaker announced crisply. "You have reached a seized federal communications device. State your name and purpose for calling the suspended line of Marcus Vance." Elijah stopped breathing. He stared at his own phone resting on the marble table, as if it had just turned into a venomous snake ready to strike. His mouth opened, but he could not force a single syllable out of his paralyzed throat. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the bright corporate lights. I stepped forward, leaning slightly over the table. "This is Harper," I said clearly into the phone's microphone. "Agent Miller from the White Collar Task Force is here with me. We are currently with Elijah in the developer boardroom." Mrs. Harper?" the agent on the phone replied, his tone shifting immediately to professional recognition. "Agent Miller, we have successfully raided Mr. Vance's downtown office. The perimeter is secure. We seized all his hard drives, his physical ledgers, and his collection of illegal notary stamps. Mr. Vance is currently in holding at the federal building and has fully confessed to manufacturing fraudulent property deeds for over 3 dozen clients, including the ones standing right in front of you. He specifically named Elijah and Trey in his sworn statement and provided all the text messages they sent him." Agent Miller picked up the phone. "Copy that," he said into the receiver. "We have the primary suspects in custody. Secure the location and we will transport them down to processing shortly." Miller tapped the screen, ending the call. The boardroom descended into a suffocating silence once again. Miller picked up the forged quitclaim deed from the table. He held it up so the overhead lights shone through the thick paper, highlighting the fake signatures and the illegal stamp. "I am officially declaring this document a federal forgery," Miller stated, his voice booming with absolute authority. "The notary seal is completely invalid. The signature of the deceased is a verified fabrication. Bringing this piece of paper across state lines to conduct a multi-million-dollar commercial transaction constitutes aggravated wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. You are not a victim, Elijah. You are the architect of a highly illegal scam, and your own hired help just handed you over to us on a silver platter to save himself." The absolute finality of the verification call sent Trey completely over the edge. My brother scrambled backward away from our father as if Elijah was suddenly contagious. "I had nothing to do with the forgery," Trey screamed, his voice shrill and panicked, tears streaming down his face. "It was all him. Elijah set the whole thing up. He told me to get the shadow loan from the syndicate. He told me to wire the $50,000 to Marcus. I just followed his instructions. You cannot arrest me. I am innocent. I did not sign anything." Elijah whipped his head around, staring at his golden child in absolute horror. Trey had just openly confessed to the entire financial side of the crime in a room full of federal agents and recording devices. "You idiot!" Elijah hissed venomously, his face contorting with sheer rage. "Shut your mouth. You are the one who spent the money. You are the one who bought those luxury cars. Do not try to put this all on me, you ungrateful coward." Brittany sat frozen in her leather chair, watching the two men she had relied on tear each other to pieces like cornered rats. The $15 million dream was dead. The luxury penthouse was gone. The shadow loan was going to destroy her life, and her husband was currently screaming a full confession to the FBI while crying on the floor. She looked at the heavy diamond ring on her finger and let out a quiet, miserable sob, realizing it was the only thing she had left in the world. The silver-haired director of acquisitions walked calmly over to the table. He picked up the corporate copies of the forged deed that Elijah had brought to the meeting. He walked over to a heavy-duty paper shredder sitting in the corner of the boardroom. He turned the machine on and fed the documents into the spinning metal blades. The loud grinding noise filled the room, serving as a fitting soundtrack to the absolute destruction of my family's empire of lies. I stood tall and watched the shredded paper fall into the plastic bin. The verification call had completely shattered their very last delusion of control. There were no more lies to hide behind. There was no more manipulation. There was only the cold, hard truth and the devastating consequences they had brought entirely upon themselves. The sound of the paper shredder finally ground to a halt, leaving a heavy mechanical silence in the air. Agent Miller stepped squarely into my father's line of sight, breaking whatever panicked trance Elijah had fallen into. Miller gestured to his partner, and the second FBI agent moved in swiftly. He grabbed Elijah's arms, which were already secured behind his back, and tightened the cold, heavy steel around his wrists. The metallic clicking sound echoed sharply off the glass walls of the boardroom. Elijah winced as the metal bit into his skin, but he did not try to fight the federal agents physically. Instead, he directed all his frantic, terrified energy toward me. The harsh reality of the federal penitentiary was finally looming over him, casting a long, dark shadow over his decades of arrogance. "Elijah Jameson," Agent Miller said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You are formally under arrest for aggravated wire fraud, the forgery of federal and state documents, and criminal conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. The United States Attorney will be seeking maximum penalties due to the monetary value of the attempted theft and the premeditated nature of your actions." Maximum penalties. Elijah repeated the words tumbling out of his mouth in a breathless, terrified rush. "No, you do not understand. I cannot go to a federal prison. I am a 60-year-old man. I have high blood pressure. I have a heart condition. You cannot just lock me away over a simple family misunderstanding. My son and I just made a mistake with the paperwork." Miller did not even blink. His expression remained completely carved out of stone. "Tell it to the judge," he replied dryly, grabbing Elijah firmly by the bicep and pulling him toward the heavy mahogany doors. It was at that exact moment that my father's fragile ego completely snapped. He dug his expensive leather shoes into the plush carpet, refusing to walk forward. He turned his head and looked at me with eyes completely filled with pure, unadulterated terror. The man who had spent my entire life looking down his nose at me, the man who had laughed when he threw me out of my grandmother's house, was suddenly begging for his life. "Harper, please!" Elijah screamed, his voice cracking painfully and echoing off the panoramic windows. "Please do not let them do this to me. I am your father. I raised you. I put a roof over your head and food on your plate when you were a little child. We share the same blood. You cannot send your own flesh and blood to rot in a federal cell." I stood perfectly still, watching him thrash uselessly against the agent's iron grip. I felt Julian step up slightly beside me, ready to intervene if my father somehow managed to break loose, but there was absolutely no need. Elijah was weak. His power had always been a cheap illusion, built on loud words and physical intimidation. Stripped of his financial leverage and exposed to the light of truth, he was just a pathetic old man in a ruined suit. I walked slowly around the marble table, my emerald green heels clicking softly against the floor. I stopped right in front of him. I looked deep into his eyes and searched my own heart for any lingering trace of sympathy. I searched for the little girl who used to desperately want her father's approval and love. But that little girl was gone. She had been starved out by decades of neglect and finally killed off at her grandmother's funeral repast. "I am not your flesh and blood, Elijah," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper that carried clearly across the quiet room. "We covered this already with the adoption papers. Legally, I am your sister. But even if we were talking about biology, it would not matter. A father is a title earned through love, sacrifice, and protection. You are just a sperm donor who spent 32 years treating me like a disease you could not cure." "But I am family," he sobbed, thick tears spilling over his eyelashes and tracking down his wrinkled, panicked face. "You have to show mercy to your family, Harper. Please, I am begging you on my knees. I will give you anything you want. I will sign whatever you want me to sign. Just tell the federal agents to drop the charges. Tell them it was all a big misunderstanding and we can go home." I tilted my head, looking at him with absolute disgust. "I remember another recent conversation about family," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. "I remember standing in Grandma's historic house just 24 hours ago, mourning the only person in the world who ever actually loved me. I remember you standing at the head of the dining room table holding a fake death certificate and smiling while my heart broke." Elijah swallowed hard, shaking his head rapidly as if trying to physically deny the memory. "Harper, I was just angry," he pleaded, his voice weak and trembling. "I was grieving my mother too. I was not thinking straight. I did not mean the cruel things I said to you. You meant every single word. I shot back, the suppressed anger finally rising into my voice. You told me to pack my cheap clothes and get out of your house. You told me that I was a massive disappointment who chose to play on a little computer. You told everyone in that room that Trey was the sole heir and that I would get absolutely nothing from the legacy my grandmother built. I leaned in closer so he could not look away from my face, forcing him to confront his own reflection in my eyes. And do you remember what else you said, Elijah? Do you remember the last little insult you threw at me right before Julian knocked on the front door? You said I was lucky you even included me in the funeral gathering. You looked me dead in the eye with pure malice and you said pity goes a long way. My father squeezed his eyes shut, unable to bear the weight of his own cruelty being weaponized against him. A low whimpering sound escaped his throat. Well, Elijah, I continued, stepping back and straightening my posture. You are standing in my corporate boardroom. You are trying to steal my $15 million. You have a disgraced notary singing like a bird in federal custody, and you are desperately begging me for mercy. But unfortunately for you, my supply of pity ran out yesterday afternoon. Agent Miller gave me a small respectful nod, acknowledging that the conversation was officially over. He and his partner grabbed Elijah by both arms, lifting him slightly off the ground, and forcefully marched him toward the heavy mahogany doors. Elijah started thrashing wildly, his polished corporate facade completely destroyed. Harper! He shrieked, his voice tearing at his vocal cords as he fought the agents. Harper, you cannot do this. You are an ungrateful brat. I am your father. I am the head of this family. You will burn in hell for this, Harper. Nobody in the room said a word to defend him. The silver-haired director of acquisitions just watched with mild distaste, brushing a speck of dust off his sleeve. Julian stood by his briefcase, completely unfazed by the screaming. Even Brittany and Trey remained absolutely silent, paralyzed by their own impending ruin, as they watched the man they followed get dragged away. The FBI agent shoved the double doors open, pushing my father out into the long carpeted hallway. His screams continued to echo down the corridor, growing fainter and fainter as they forced him toward the executive elevators. I listened to his desperate curses until the heavy ding of the elevator doors signaled his final departure from my life. The man who had demanded total control over everyone around him was currently locked in a metal box on his way to a concrete cell where he would spend the rest of his miserable life being told exactly when to eat, sleep, and speak. I turned back to face the boardroom. Half the toxic cancer had been completely excised from my life, but the other half was still sitting right there on the floor. I looked down at my brother Trey and his greedy wife Brittany. Their $2 million shadow loan was ticking like a time bomb and the banks were about to close. I watched Trey stare at his expensive gold watch, the second hand sweeping relentlessly toward the top of the hour. It was 4:45 in the afternoon, 15 minutes until the Shadow Syndicate officially declared his $2 million cash advance in default. 15 minutes until the predatory lenders initiated the hostile seizure of his personal home. The reality of his monumental stupidity was finally crashing down on him, crushing the last remaining fragments of his inflated ego. Brittany was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she stared at the empty space where Elijah had just been dragged away in handcuffs. She slowly turned her head and looked at her husband. The man she had married solely for his proximity to generational wealth was now practically vibrating with sheer panic on the floor. The illusion of the golden child was completely shattered. He was not a real estate mogul. He was a fraud who had just gambled away their entire life on a stolen piece of paper. "What are we going to do?" Brittany whispered, her voice shaking with a terrifying mix of fear and rising rage. "Trey, you have to fix this. Call the bank. Call somebody. They cannot take my house. My clothes are in there. My cars are parked in the driveway. You promised me a penthouse, Trey. You promised me $15 million today." Trey looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot and filled with absolute despair. "There is no $15 million, Brittany." He choked out the words, scraping painfully against his throat. It is gone. The money we spent is gone. The loan sharks are going to take everything. We are completely broke. The word broke echoed through the quiet boardroom like a physical blow. Brittany's face contorted into an ugly mask of pure unadulterated fury. She did not offer her husband comfort. She did not tell him they would figure it out together. Because her love had always been entirely conditional based on the balance of his bank account. She stood up from her leather chair, her hands balled into tight fists. "You useless, pathetic loser!" She shrieked, her voice completely devoid of any affection. "You dragged me into this mess. You told me Elijah had everything under control. I married you because you were supposed to be the heir to the Odessa estate. And you are nothing. You are absolutely nothing." Trey scrambled to his knees, reaching out to grab the hem of her expensive white cocktail dress. "Brittany, please do not do this," he begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "We can start over. We can figure something out. I love you." Brittany did not hesitate. She pulled her arm back and slapped Trey across the face with all the strength she could muster. The sharp cracking sound echoed violently across the marble table. Trey cried out, falling backward onto the plush carpet and clutching his rapidly reddening cheek. "Do not touch me!" Brittany screamed, stepping away from him as if he was a disease. "I am not going down with you. I am not taking on $2 million of dirty debt because you were too stupid to realize your own sister was setting a trap. I am filing for divorce the second I leave this building. My lawyers are going to strip you of whatever pitiful assets you have left." She frantically grabbed her left hand and yanked the massive 4-carat diamond ring off her finger. The ring she had bought with stolen syndicate money just a few days ago. She threw it as hard as she could directly at Trey's face. The heavy piece of jewelry bounced off his shoulder and clattered loudly across the floor, rolling away into a corner of the room. "I want nothing to do with you or your disgusting family," Brittany spat, grabbing her designer clutch from the table. She did not even look at me as she stormed toward the heavy mahogany doors. She pushed them open and ran down the hallway, her high heels clicking frantically against the floorboards as she rushed to escape the sinking ship. Trey watched his wife abandon him, leaving him completely alone in the wreckage of his own life. He let out a guttural, sobbing wail that sounded more animal than human. He turned his tear-stained face toward me and crawled across the carpet until he was right at my feet. "Harper, please," Trey pleaded, looking up at me with pathetic, desperate eyes. "You are my sister. You have so much money. You own this entire company. Please just pay the syndicate. Please save my house. I will do anything you want. I will work for you. I will clean your floors. I have nowhere else to go, Harper. I am going to be homeless." I looked down at the man who had mocked me, humiliated me, and laughed while my clothes were thrown down a staircase. I reached into my oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a folded piece of black plastic. It was the exact same heavy-duty black trash bag that Brittany had kicked down the stairs at Grandma's house yesterday. I had picked it up off the foyer floor and carried it with me for this exact moment. I dropped the empty black trash bag onto the floor right in front of his knees. "Go find somewhere else to live, Trey," I said, my voice completely cold and void of any mercy. "The board meeting is over." I turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving my brother crying on the floor next to an empty garbage bag. Julian followed me out, shutting the heavy mahogany doors tightly behind us, sealing Trey inside his own self-made tomb. The air in the hallway immediately felt lighter and cleaner. The suffocating weight of my toxic family had finally been lifted from my shoulders forever. 3 years have passed since that day in the glass boardroom. Elijah was convicted of aggravated wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Trey lost his home, his luxury cars, and his wife by the end of that week. The Shadow Syndicate seized absolutely everything, leaving him bankrupt and completely alone. I do not know where he is now, and I honestly do not care. I stand on the sweeping glass balcony of my luxury penthouse, letting the warm Atlanta breeze wash over my face. I hold a cup of black coffee in my hand, looking down at the sprawling city skyline. Right in the center of the bustling metropolis sits the historic commercial estate that my grandmother Odessa fought so hard to protect. The old, crumbling structures have been carefully renovated and expanded. The land was not sold to a gentrifying corporate developer. Instead, I used the immense resources of my blind trust to transform the entire block into the Odessa Center for Innovation. It is now a state-of-the-art business incubator completely dedicated to funding and supporting Black women entrepreneurs. Where my family only saw a quick payday, I saw the continuation of a powerful legacy. Every single day, dozens of brilliant independent women walk through those doors to build their own empires free from the predatory systems that tried to hold my grandmother back. They are creating generational wealth the right way, through hard work, intelligence, and unwavering solidarity. I watch the morning sunlight reflect off the newly polished brickwork of the center, and I feel a profound sense of absolute peace. Cutting off toxic family members is the hardest thing you will ever have to do. Society conditions us to believe that blood is thicker than water, and that we must endlessly forgive the people who continuously break our hearts. But that is a dangerous lie designed to keep victims trapped in the cycle of abuse. Blood does not give anyone the right to disrespect you, manipulate you, or steal your future. When I stopped seeking validation from the people who were committed to misunderstanding me, I finally found my true power. I stopped playing the role of the quiet scapegoat and stepped into my position as the architect of my own destiny. I walked through the fire of their betrayal and came out completely untouchable. The wounds they inflicted on me took a very long time to heal, but the scars serve as a permanent reminder of my own strength. I am no longer the little girl hiding in the shadows of a grand colonial house hoping to be noticed. I am Harper. I am a forensic accountant, a chief executive officer, and the fiercely proud guardian of my grandmother's legacy. If you are listening to this and you are currently suffocating under the weight of a toxic family, please know that you do not have to stay. You do not have to accept their disrespect simply because you share a last name. You have the power to walk away and build a life that is entirely your own. The journey is terrifying and the grief is real, but the freedom waiting for you on the other side is absolutely priceless. Thank you for listening to my story today. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience, justice, and reclaiming your truth. Share this video with someone who might need the courage to set their own boundaries and break free. And always remember that the most beautiful family you will ever have is the one you actively choose to build around yourself.